This is a mono duo, and it guides through a narrowband filter. And you would think that with a shorter focal length and a faster f-ratio, guiding might be easier, right? Well, the answer to this question actually will probably surprise you a little bit. Now, I did a video previously where I kind of torture tested my mono duo, shooting through narrowband filters, and actually this scope and setup right here, I'm just using a one-shot killer at the present. But anyways, in that test, I found that the mono duo was able to guide in virtually every single circumstance that I could throw at it. This is an aperture mask which basically stopped this telescope down to f10. And even when I pointed this assembly at the darkest section of sky in which there were no stars, not even on a star chart, the mono duo was still able to guide, even through 5 nanometer narrowband filters. So I've been testing this little guy, and once again, I mean, really, I haven't had any difficulty guiding. I've always been able to guide. However, this little guy, which is f4.5, very, very fast, I've basically been able to reach the limit of what my mono duo can do with this scope. Why is that? Okay, well, it's a very simple answer, and that's because of image circle size. And I know I've been in contact with by a few members who watch my channel, and like they've reported that they've had difficulty guiding through a narrowband filter with their mono duo. And in every single scenario, it has always been the same thing. The problem was not the f-stop of the scope, or the speed of the scope. It was not the narrowband filter. It was the fact that they had a scope with an image circle size that was too small. Right? Now, this is a small scope. It's significantly smaller than the other scope I was just at. It's 275 millimeter focal length, you know, a rather short focal length. A lot of camera lenses are this long. It's f4.5. It's a 61 millimeter aperture. So it's tiny, okay? But even though it's a fast f4.5, it has a very small image circle compared to my bigger scope, but also the fall off, or the vignetting, is quite a bit more sudden, and because of that, the guiding sensor of my duo is kind of out of the image circle of the scope. So by way of a lesson and a little bit of, you know, just interesting information here, so I've drawn a graph here, and the top of the chart is going to indicate maximum transmission, and then of course as we get lower and lower in the chart, we're seeing transmission reduced. And then this axis of the chart is basically, this would be the center of the image circle, and this out here would be the outer edge of it. And what these two slopes represent is they represent vignetting. And all scopes have this, and that's why the Sharpstar that I have, this small tiny scope, is having a greater difficulty with guiding versus the slower SV Pony. And this is something that's inherent in all fast versus slow scopes. Basically what you have is the purple line here kind of represents the slower scope. You can see that at the top here they have kind of basically the same transmission. But then something starts to happen. When you start to get to that vignetting field, or the plane where, you know, the amount of light starts to drop off, you'll see that the slower scope, represented by the purple line, actually drops off more slowly. Its vignette field is more diffuse, okay? And then the faster scope, it starts to drop off very, very fast, very sharp. Yes, it might be brighter here in the beginning, in the very beginning transition zone of, you know, the vignette, but it starts to fall off very quickly, and its transition from basically image to no image is much more sudden. All right, so I'm going to put up here a table basically, which is going to show you the guiding results that I've had with the scenario that I just showed you, my little Sharpstar 61 EDPH Mark II. And you can see that I was still able to guide. And in fact, the performance of the scope was actually a little bit surprising. In the past, traditionally, I've usually had my best guiding at 4 seconds. However, the mono duo seemed to like a shorter exposure, more like a 2-second exposure length. That's just kind of where the sweet spot sort of felt. But then after that, of course, it radically dropped off in performance, and that was because it just isn't getting enough light. Now, The 6180PH Mark II, it's marked to be able to handle a 35mm sensor by the company that sells it. However, it just can't. All right. The stars actually were kind of weirdly shaped. They were, basically very, very distorted in the guide camera. And a couple of other interesting things about it was that I noticed that the focal length difference between the guide camera and the actual imaging sensor, which is an APS-C size sensor, was different by 3mm. And that's because of the curvature of the field of the smaller scope that I'm using. And this kind of boils down to simple physics. When you make everything smaller, using a bigger sensor becomes more difficult optically. Correcting for it, it gets more difficult. And I know my SV Bony, my 122, that is a scope that has kind of inferior technology built into the optics, and yet it performs better. In fact, there was only a 1mm difference between the focal length of the guide camera and the actual imaging sensor. Now, one thing to note here is that even though the stars were kind of distorted in my SharpStar, that really didn't affect guiding too much. It might affect it in one direction, maybe not the width of the star, depending on the distortion direction that it was going. But yeah, for a distorted star actually isn't going to really harm the algorithm that is used to do guiding. Okay, so if that's something that you're concerned about, don't worry about it. If you're wondering yourself, okay, is a Duo camera going to work with my setup? Really, the answer isn't, is my scope fast enough? It is not, is my camera, the sensor in it, sensitive enough to see through a narrowband filter? I've kind of proven with this guy that it is capable of seeing through any filter and in any condition. The only limiting thing might be your image circle size and the vignette of your scope, which contrasts the difference between these two guys. Now, I personally love these Duo cameras. In fact, I think I'm going to continue to say that the only camera that I think that I will ever want to buy again will be something that is a Duo. Simply because it is easier and it is better, and it kind of really is the future. 2 years ago, I asked the question, is it going to be the future? And I think it is. So yeah, I love these things, and that's kind of has been my experience with this guy, the little tiny scope, and it still works great. Just doesn't quite work as good as this guy, and that's because of the image circle size and the vignetting of this scope. And this is something that, I'm emphasizing it because this doesn't get emphasized by anybody else. All the manufacturers, when they talk about the image circle size of their scope, they're talking about how large the corrected field is, not the actual illumination size. And I would like to see manufacturers start mentioning both numbers, because we kind of need that. One last thing. With my Mono Duo and the SharpStar EDPH and the mount, I'm still getting the best guiding that I have ever been able to get. And I have tried off-axis guiders, and I've also tried little secondary guide scopes to go along with it. The Duo has done the best.